coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're ignorant.
They're coming for you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're acting like a child.
They're coming for you. Look, there comes one of them now.
Welcome to episode 37 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnston, and this week we have our first zombie movie of the series, as well as an unusual take on demonic possession. Both films also share explicit or implicit concerns about man's impact on the environment, suggesting that through either ignorance or inability to heed essential warnings, we will bring about our own demise. So first up, we have The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue from 1974 and director Jorge Grau. This was an Italian and Spanish co-production and released under numerous titles, including Let Sleeping Corpses Lie, The Living Dead, Don't Open the Window, and many others. It stars Ray Lovelock, Cristina Galbo, and Arthur Kennedy. Then we follow this with When Evil Lurks from 2023 and director Demian Rugna. This is an Argentinian and American co-production and stars Ezequiel Rodriguez, Demian Salomon, Silvina Sabater, and Luis Ziembrowski. Along the way, we'll be discussing the impact of 1968's Night of the Living Dead on the zombie horror subgenre, the careers of directors Jorge Grau and Demian Rugna, the birth of the modern environmental movement, and much, much more. As always, though, before we do any of that, I'd just like to mention the key sources and references that I've used for this week's episode. When discussing The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue and the history of the zombie movie, I have heavily referenced the book of the Dead, The Complete History of Zombie Cinema by Jamie Russell, and also Nightmare Movies by Kim Newman, and the Spanish horror film by Antonio Lazzaro Reboll. I've also heavily referenced the documentary Jorge Grau, Catalina's Cult Film King, from the Synapse Blu-ray release of the movie, and a 3-part interview with the director that can be found on YouTube, and which will be linked in the show notes. And when discussing When Evil Lurks, I have referenced the website demianrugna.com, interviews and features on the Second Sight 4K Special Edition of the movie, and interviews that can be found on the websites letterboxd.com, thehollywoodnews.com, polygon.com, and goreinthestore.uk. And as always for both movies, I have also referred to the Wikipedia and IMDb pages for the films, their cast and crew. And just before we get into this episode, I would also like to give you a heads up about some additional spoilers. As well as the two movies under discussion this week, I am also going to be fairly heavily spoiling the 1968 movie Night of the Living Dead. Though, to be honest, if you've yet to see that film, I'm not really sure what you're doing listening to this podcast at all. And if that is you, I would highly recommend pressing pause and correcting that at your earliest opportunity. As we mentioned in last week's episode, the 1968 release of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead fundamentally changed the landscape of horror. The slow transformation initiated by Psycho in 1960 was suddenly shifted into a much higher gear, not only in terms of violence, but also social commentary. As Jamie Russell writes in his excellent Book of the Dead, The Complete History of Zombie Cinema, quote, "This was a film that dragged American horror kicking and screaming into the modern age." End quote. Looking back, nearly 60 years later, it's hard to imagine the impact the film had on its contemporary audience, particularly when viewed through a lens coloured blood red by the likes of Terrifier and its many sequels. Variety, at the time, described it as the pornography of violence, going on to say that the film, quote, casts serious aspersions on the integrity and social responsibility of its Pittsburgh-based makers, its distributor, Walter Reed, and the film industry as a whole, as well as raising doubts about the future of the regional cinema movement and about the moral health of filmgoers who cheerfully opt for this unrelieved orgy of sadism. End quote. Roger Ebert, as we've previously discussed in several episodes, hardly had an unbiased view when it came to horror, and he, rather unsurprisingly, went one step further, writing a lengthy letter of warning that was printed in the pages of the Reader's Digest. Quote, the kids in the audience were stunned. There was almost complete silence. The movie had long ago stopped being delightfully scary and had become unexpectedly terrifying. A little girl across the aisle from me, maybe 9 years old, was sitting very still in her seat and crying. I don't think the younger kids really knew what hit them. They'd seen horror movies before, but this was something else. This was ghouls eating people. You could actually see what they were eating. This was little girls killing their mothers. This was being set on fire. Worst of all, nobody got out alive. Even the hero got killed. I felt real terror in that neighborhood theater. I saw kids who had no resources that they could draw on to protect themselves from the dread and fear they felt. End quote. Quite what a 9-year-old girl was doing watching Night of the Living Dead, even in 1968, is quite beyond me, and to be honest, I blame the parents. But I think her presence is testament to how fully unprepared audiences were for what was about to hit them. Little wonder, then, that the gothic horrors of Hammer Studios paled by comparison. More than that, though, Night of the Living Dead fundamentally changed the public perception of the horror trope of the zombie, which had, up to this point, largely been based on its Caribbean origins. The first ever zombie movie was White Zombie, released in 1932, and which starred Bela Lugosi as a menacing antagonist on the island of Haiti, who zombifies people to work as slaves in his sugarcane mill. This was loosely based on a book called The Magic Island, a travel journal written by a man called William Seabrook, which purported to be an account of his time on the island and his experience of voodoo. In my opinion, and the opinion of many anthropologists, it's an appallingly ill-informed and highly exaggerated piece of writing, steeped in a racism regarding the island and its spiritual practices that still continues to this day. Many retrospective writers have pointed out the convenience of the book's timing. It came out during a time when the US was occupying Haiti, and it probably went some way to, quote-unquote, justifying the presence of the US Marines. According to them, the book was, quote, part of a larger racist discourse that tried to legitimize and reinterpret the USA's aggressive expansion into the Caribbean as a civilizing mission, by demonizing Haitian society and culture in the process. We'll be talking about the misrepresentation of Haiti and the practice of voodoo in a future episode, so I won't say much more on the topic here, but suffice it to say that on its publication in January 1929, the book was an absolute sensation. The Literary Guild of New York selected it as its Book of the Month, and it was also listed as one of the best-selling non-fiction books of the year, though I use the term non-fiction rather advisedly. It also inspired a stage play, the imaginatively titled Zombie, which ran on Broadway. This, in turn, led to the Lugosi movie, creating a horror trope that pretty much stayed the same up until Romero shifted the narrative in the late 1960s. Up to the moment that Barbara discovered that yes, they were indeed coming to get her, zombies may have looked terrifying, but in many depictions they were under the control of a far more menacing antagonist. And this is a trope that we see even in Hammer's excellent Plague of the Zombies, released just 2 years before Night of the Living Dead, would appall Roger Ebert and terrify an unspecified 9-year-old girl. Romero's movie changed all of this, not only bringing the trope home to rural America, but transforming the zombie into a flesh-eating ghoul, a horror movie staple that can only be destroyed by shooting them in the head. More than this, the film also provided significant social commentary. The hero, Ben, played by Dwayne Jones, is black, although, according to Romero, the casting was based more on the quality of his audition than a deliberate and conscious attempt to make a statement. Regardless, the ending of the film, where Ben is shot in the head by a gun-toting posse, spoke directly to racial tensions of the time. And the very same posse also reflects cultural anxiety surrounding the Vietnam War, as well as anticipating the shootings at Kent State University, which would occur 2 years later, in 1970. Again, Romero has said that any allegory was not intentional, consciously at least, explaining in a 1973 interview, quote, "It wasn't a conscious effort on my part to direct that allegory into the film, but I guess it was a strong enough influence that it came out anyway, and people are seeing that it's there." End quote. Given the impact of the film, one might have expected a wave of immediate imitations, but in reality, they were rather thin on the ground. This is a little bit surprising, given that just 10 years later, his follow-up, Dawn of the Dead, would unleash a veritable horde of zombie movies, particularly after Lucio Fulci released his version, Zombie, also known as Zombie Flesh Eaters, in 1979. Why this didn't happen after the original 1968 movie is rather unclear. My own opinion is that, given that the rash of later imitators stemmed largely from Italy, it has far more to do with the filmmaking industry in that country than it does anything else. In the late 1960s, the Italians were busy making westerns, inspired by Sergio Leone, and then became heavily occupied by an explosion of giallo films from 1970 onwards. So, in other words, my thoughts are that they were just far too busy with other profitable genres to be bothered with the zombie. That isn't to say, though, that there were no attempts whatsoever, though these tend to be more in the spirit of Romero's movie than complete copy and paste stories. In 1972, Bob Clark released Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, which features a zombie called Orville, and in 1974, his follow-up, Death Dream, also known as Dead of Night, features an undead soldier returning from the Vietnam War. 1973's Messiah of Evil has local residents turn into flesh-eating ghouls, and 1971's Let's Scare Jessica to Death features similar townsfolk who seem part zombie and part vampire, though they are far more menacing than they are flesh-eating. In Europe, though, things were a little bit different. Beginning in 1972, Spanish director Armondo de Ossario introduced his own variant on the Living Dead with a series of films that have since been categorized under the heading of the Blind Dead saga. These feature the reanimated corpses of the historical figures of the Knights Templar, though de Ossario was very quick to point out that these were, quote, entirely different from zombies or any other kind of living dead creature, and were instead, in his own words, mummies on horseback. To my ear, at least, Mummies on Horseback is a far better title for the series than The Blind Dead, but that's just my opinion. The first of these was Tombs of the Blind Dead, which was followed in 1973 by Return of the Evil Dead, The Ghost Galleon in 1974, and Night of the Seagulls in 1975. The press book for the first movie introduced the, admittedly highly original, antagonists with the words, quote, "Bells that do not exist ring in the empty belfry. Their pealing makes the ground tremble. Graves open and tombs turn over. Cadaverous, skeletal hands emerge from beneath the marble slabs, and the mummified corpses of the old Knights Templar who inhabited the abbey centuries ago come to the surface." End quote. Although the series has developed a devoted cult following, I just have to say that despite some very nice slow-motion imagery of the Knights on horseback, I'm not really one of them. and it would appear that writer Kim Newman is even less so, describing the films as uniformly tiresome and going on to say that, quote, "It seems as if everybody in Spanish horror films is compelled to wear Carnaby Street dresses, polo neck pullovers, or macho man medallions," end quote. But, as I say, the films do have a very devoted cult following, and whilst I personally wouldn't recommend the entire series, you might at least want to visit the first one to see if the Templars are to your taste, macho man medallions notwithstanding. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it would take an Italian producer, along with a Spanish director, to deliver the first real homage to Romero's movie, a deliberate strategy to essentially redo Night of the Living Dead, but this time in colour. All of which then brings us on to our first movie of the week, which is The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue from 1974, directed by Jorge Grau. And although this was released under numerous titles, for this episode I've chosen to refer to it under the one by which I know it best. But a closer translation of its original Spanish title is Do Not Disturb the Sleep of the Dead. This stars Ray Lovelock, Cristina Galbo, and Arthur Kennedy, and was produced by Edmondo Amati. Edmondo Amati was an Italian producer responsible for no small number of genre pictures, covering a very wide range of styles. These include the James Bond-inspired Agent 077 Mission Bloody Mary in 1965, and its follow-up From the Orient with Fury, released the same year. He also produced the buddy comedy Two Mafiosi Against Gold Ginger, and no prizes for guessing the inspiration for that one, as well as a handful of Italian westerns, and the Lucio Fulci-directed gialli, One on Top of the Other in 1968, Lizard in a Woman's Skin in 1971, and one of my favourite gialli of all time, 1972's Don't Torture a Duckling. He would also go on to produce the Exorcist ripoff The Antichrist in 1974 and the Omen ripoff Holocaust 2000 in 1977. So, as you can tell, if nothing else, this was a man with a very keen eye on cinematic trends. Heavily inspired by the success of Night of the Living Dead, it might have taken Amati a full 6 years to see his idea come to fruition, but it's fair to say that with The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, he more than delivers the goods. This movie gives us not only flesh-eating zombies in full colour, but also a very timely social commentary, though much of this is down to screenwriter Sandro Continenza and Spanish director Jorge Grau. Like several directors who produced work during the so-called golden age of Spanish horror, Jorge Grau was not really a horror director at all. In fact, his background was more in documentary and art house cinema than it was in the macabre. Other directors that fall into this category include Juan Antonio Bardem with The Corruption of Chris Miller in 1973, Vicente Aranda with his version of the novella Carmilla, titled The Blood-Splattered Bride, released in 1972, and Javier Aguirre with Count Dracula's Great Love, also released in 1972, and starring the undisputed king of Spanish horror, Paul Naschy. We talked about the golden age of Spanish horror and the political climate that led to it right back in episode 1. So if you'd like to know more about why so many directors were attracted to the once banned horror genre, I would recommend giving it a listen. And you might also want to check out episode 12 for the discussion on Bardem's The Corruption of Chris Miller, which is another favourite of mine. Jorge Grau was born in 1930 in Barcelona and initially studied theatre at the Institut del Teatre, a historic school for the performing arts that was founded in 1913. He first went into filmmaking when he was asked to help with amateur film productions, a story that he describes in a documentary on the Synapse Blu-ray release of Manchester Morgue. Saying that Barcelona at the time was home to many amateur filmmakers, he observed that the work they produced was all very good visually, but that the acting was rather poor. And this was something that he attributed to the filmmaker's focus being largely on the beauty of the image rather than on the quality of the performer. On one occasion, when asked to help with the actors' performances, he observed that the camera was placed in such a way that all it was capturing was the actor's back, and so he suggested repositioning it so that the face and expressions could be seen. Offering further advice, he said that ultimately he pretty much directed the entire film, and this experience led to a passion for cinema, joining various film societies, and eventually finding work as a director's assistant in Madrid. One of these projects was working on a film with the Italian director Riccardo Freda, who himself would go on to make several cult movies, including the horrible Dr. Hitchcock in 1962, Double Face in 1969, and The Iguana with a Tongue of Fire in 1971. On this occasion, Freda was directing a movie called Man in a Net, though due to what Grau euphemistically termed quote-unquote erotic problems, the director was often absent from the set, leaving Grau, according to him at least, to finish the movie himself. In the late 1950s, he won a scholarship to study at a film school in Rome, where he lived for a year and immersed himself in modern European cinema. This moved him away from his background of nationalistic and Catholic Spain and into a world led by directors, including Rossellini, Antonioni, and Federico Fellini, with whom he became friends. During this time, he started working on his first screenplay, titled Summer Night, which, after years of being in pre-production limbo, would eventually be made in 1962. Returning to Spain, where he filmed Summer Night, he continued to direct dramas and documentaries, and his name soon became linked with the so-called Barcelona School of Filmmaking. This was an umbrella term for a group of young directors who worked in innovative and avant-garde film styles that acted as a countercultural resistance to the artistic and political censorship of the Franco regime. Across this period, he made many films across many genres, but he was also interested in making a horror movie. His idea was based on the legend of Erzsébet Bathory, the Hungarian countess who allegedly bathed in blood to preserve her youth and beauty. Initially discouraged from moving into horror by pretty much everyone around him, he nevertheless held on to the story, and as the horror genre exploded in Spain in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the idea finally came to fruition. The film was released in 1973 and titled Blood Ceremony, though you will find it on YouTube under its English language title, The Legend of Blood Castle. This was, of course, based on the same legend that inspired Hammer's Countess Dracula, which starred Ingrid Pitt, and which had been released in 1970. Of the two, I have to say I prefer Grau's version of the story, which I find more visually and thematically stimulating, Ingrid Pitt notwithstanding. When trying to get the film off the ground, Grau used his contacts from his days in Italy, who introduced him to producer Edmondo Amati. But at the time, Amati was already in search for his colour version of Night of the Living Dead, and his suggestions to incorporate elements of that into Grau's film weren't exactly right for the project, and the two parted ways. However, Amati was clearly not one to give up easily, and as Grau wrapped on Blood Ceremony, the producer got back in contact, proposing again that they make his idea. According to Jorge Grau, quote, "He offered me a script by Sandro Continenza, who I knew. He was very intelligent, very good. He invited me to lunch to tell me that I had to read the script. I thought the guy was a little crazy, but since he invited me to lunch, I decided to take the script and read it. I found the script highly mysterious, with an ecological intention, announcing the environmental degradation where progress causes drama." End quote. And now we are getting into the spoilers, including the ending, so if you have yet to watch the movie, please tread very carefully from this point onwards. As listeners of episode 1 will know, many Spanish films were shot in foreign countries to avoid the heavy hand of Franco's censors, and with its blatant political subtext and extreme violence, it's quite easy to see why that was the case here. Manchester was chosen as the location due to its historical reputation for being a heavily polluted city. This was following years as a centre of industry, particularly during the 1950s. But by the time Grau's film went into production, things had changed a little. In an interview for the documentary on the Synapse Blu-ray release, Grau explained this further, saying, quote, "The story was set in Manchester. It was like a magic name for the producer, because he said it was a very polluted city long ago. Okay, I didn't know Manchester, but I went there and I saw a clean city. They had got rid of pollution everywhere. It was absolutely clean. And I thought, well, I'd seen a picture of Glasgow, almost black, with coal black houses. And I said, let's go and see Glasgow. We took the car, went to Glasgow, and it was really impressive. It was clean later, but at that time, it was impressive. But Manchester was the producer's magic name, and he said no. I had signed a contract to make a film set in Manchester, and I had to accept it. But I still have the memory of that impressive city, Glasgow, where I'd spent just 2 days." End quote. Of course, Glasgow is indeed a very different city today, with the Clean Air Act having much the same effects there as it did on Manchester. I'm also not sure what the English language title would have ended up being if Grau had gotten his way, as we probably would have lost some of the alliteration, unless they went with something like Ghouls in the Glasgow Morgue, or even Ghouls over Glasgow. I do know that I've got quite a few listeners in that city. Hello, by the way. So, as always, any suggestions are welcome by email. However, the city does still get a mention, with the mechanic at the garage saying that the parts needed to repair George's bike would have to be shipped from Glasgow, which seems rather odd, given that it's over 100 miles away from the film's supposed location. Ironically, though, given Amati's obsession and the film's English language title, Manchester itself only features in the first few minutes, as we follow George, a partner in an antique business based in the city, shutting up shop to get away for a weekend in the country. In the narrative, his destination is Windermere in the Lake District, but in reality, the exteriors were filmed many miles away on location in the Peak District of Derbyshire. Stopping at a petrol station, his motorbike is damaged when our heroine, Edna, accidentally backs her car into it, leaving George without any form of transport. He insists that the very least Edna can do is offer him a lift to his destination, and, in a clear display of 1970s sexism, also insists that he drives. Along the journey, Edna suggests that he take her to her destination, the fictional town of Southgate, first of all, saying that she will send somebody to Windermere to collect the car a little bit later. En route, the two become lost, and stopping to ask for directions at a farm, George sees an experimental machine operated by scientists from the Ministry of Agriculture. This turns out to be a new electronic form of pest control being tested at the farm, a device that sends out sonic radiation to destroy parasites and insects. "I'd send it back to where it came from," says George, "and keep the insects and parasites that nature has given you. It's just another machine to pollute the earth. Till now, at least, this part of the country's been left alone." Meanwhile, Edna, who is waiting by the car, is attacked by a strange man. Fleeing to George for help, when they return to the car, the man has disappeared. But the farmer remarks that Edna's description sounds strangely like Guthrie, a homeless man who had died from drowning only a week before. The action then shifts to Katie and Martin's house, a couple who we later discover are Edna's sister and brother-in-law. Their home is pure 1970s bohemia, as well it might be. Martin is a photographer, and we soon find out that Katie is a relapsed heroin addict. The reason for Edna's visit is to discuss sending Katie to a clinic to help cure her of her addiction once and for all. As Martin takes photographs by the river, Katie prepares what is presumably meant to be her final fix. But, in doing so, she is interrupted by the man who attacked Edna, who has broken into their tool shed. A terrified Katie runs to Martin for help, but trying to defend his wife, he is killed in the struggle. And when George and Edna arrive on the scene, the mysterious man has disappeared once again. The police are called, and they are led by an incredibly aggressive and moralistic police inspector who immediately blames Katie for the murder. After all, she is a drug addict, and who knows what monstrosities these people are capable of. He is equally hostile to George and Edna, seemingly offended by George's long hair, beard and fashionable dress sense, and assuming him to be a member of a counterculture that is an affront to the eyes of the law. Katie is taken to the local hospital, and from here on in, George and Edna, who have hardly had the most amicable of introductions, conduct their own investigations, coming under increasing suspicion and attack from the police inspector, both verbally and physically. As the investigation continues, it soon transpires that the electronic waves radiated by the experimental machine don't only affect the local insect population. Babies in the local hospital are born with incredibly violent tendencies, and the dead are returning to life. The question is, will anybody, particularly the police inspector, actually believe them? According to writer Kyle Bishop, quote, "Zombie narratives manifest the predominant cultural anxieties of their time, anxieties usually repressed or ignored by mainstream media," end quote. And, as you can tell from that very brief synopsis, there is a lot of subtext in Manchester Morgue. Although the film is a co-production between Italy and Spain, like many Spanish horrors of the time, the film is a thinly veiled, and some might say not that veiled at all, attack on fascism, with the inspector quite clearly a stand-in for the nationalist control exerted by General Franco at the time. The script goes so far as to even have George mockingly give him a fascist salute, which is hardly subtle, but it certainly delivers the point. And while the gesture is accompanied by a sarcastic Heil Hitler, it is certainly worth remembering that the salute was one also favoured by Franco and his nationalist party. The inspector's dialogue, delivered with considerable venom by actor Arthur Kennedy, represents not only the fascist view of the alternative and the other, but also conflict between the old world and the new, the establishment and the anti-establishment, and the rift across generations. And this is something that we've seen in other films of the period, including Let's Scare Jessica to Death, Witchfinder General, and The House of Whipcord. He angrily sneers at George, quote, "You're all the same, the lot of you, with your long hair and faggot clothes, drugs, sex, and every sort of filth. And you hate the police, don't you?" End quote. So, you can hardly blame George for his remarkably well-timed response, "You make it easy." The inspector is not the only authority figure blinded by his own prejudice, or indeed stupidity. Perkins, a colleague that we first meet in the churchyard, manages to convince the inspector that the murders are a case of Satanism, pointing out the cross ripped from the ground and, rather laughably, given the levels of carnage, saying, quote, "It looks to me like a fairly typical case," end quote. Despite the ludicrous claims, the inspector decides that Perkins must be correct and uses George's antiques as a proof of Satanism. It's also his rationale for ultimately shooting George dead multiple times during the attack at the hospital, in a climax which echoes not just the end of Night of the Living Dead, but also Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde from 1967 and Easy Rider from 1969. "I wish the dead could come back to life, you bastard," he sneers over George's body, "because then I could kill you again." He follows this, at the end of the film, with an incredibly smug piece of self-congratulation as he travels back to his hotel in the car with a colleague. Saying, quote, Justice has been a bit slow in these parts with all this permissive rot going on. Maybe people learned a thing or two from my example here." End quote. The inspector is played magnificently by Arthur Kennedy, an American stage and film actor who had won a Tony Award for his performance in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman in 1949, and also the 1955 Golden Globe Award for Best Supporting Actor for his performance in the film The Trial. A 5-time Oscar nominee, he starred in many significant films from the 1940s through to the 1960s, including The Glass Menagerie, The Desperate Hours, Peyton Place, and Lawrence of Arabia, to name just a few. Sadly, though, like many actors of his generation, he developed a problem with alcohol, something that he called an on-again, off-again battle, and this greatly impacted his employability. Forced to appear in what he doubtless considered lower-quality productions, he arrived to film Manchester Morgue expecting much of the same, but was pleasantly surprised by the director's approach to the film, with Grau later saying, quote, "When he saw that I was taking the film seriously, and that I wasn't just doing it for the sake of it, he dedicated himself fully and became almost a collaborator on the film. It was a marvelous experience." End quote. Part of the trick, Grau later said, was that he encouraged the actor to channel his resentment around his deteriorating career into the backstory for the character, giving Kennedy's performance a greater depth and making the inspector a much more rounded screen presence, particularly in his rants against George and the counterculture. As well as the clear metaphor for fascism provided by the inspector, the central theme of the film is one of environmental interference and collapse. The living dead are quite literally created by science and its attempts at progress, and whilst at some points the dialogue might feel a little bit laid on with a trowel, you can't help but find it all depressingly prescient. The opening of the film is masterfully bleak, depicting endless exhaust fumes and cooling towers intercut with the green British countryside. Largely filmed guerrilla style and capturing real people, the images shown include a man emerging from the train station wearing a face mask, which, in the post-pandemic world of 2026, now has a very different resonance than it did back in 1974. A bowler-hatted man pops pills in a chemist's doorway, rubbish lies everywhere, and Grau's director credit is overlaid on the image of a dead bird. As George eventually leaves the city for the green and pleasant land of the Lake District, a woman rips off her clothes and runs naked from the steps of a church through the streets, largely ignored by the apathetic passers-by. Grau has called this moment a reflection of the times, saying, quote, "Some revolutionaries were on the streets, some of them naked, talking about freedom. People could or couldn't care about them. It had a function. You could see how people ignore a woman who gets naked for freedom. They look the other way. They don't care. It's an announcement against an indifferent, selfish society which hardly thinks about anyone else." End quote. As Jamie Russell keenly notes in his excellent Book of the Dead, quote, "Clearly, the hippie dream has given way to pollution, ennui, and the beginning of the strike-filled, unemployment-soaring 1970s." End quote. An observation that also connects Manchester Morgue to the idea of the death of the love generation, which we've discussed previously. Director Edgar Wright uses similar imagery of societal ennui, albeit without the streaking and to comedic effect, in 2004's affectionate zombie spoof Shaun of the Dead, and as he is a long-term fan of Grau's movie, it's pretty obvious to see his influences here in retrospect. The environmental theme that has been introduced across the opening montage is extended as George and Edna drive towards Windermere, with a radio news report stating that ecological problems have been exaggerated and warning against hysteria. "What rot," George says. "Ecological problems exaggerated. You know, of course, when we all die, only the scientists will survive." The idea of science and technology as instruments of destruction is continued even further, with George's previously mentioned comments on first seeing the sonic radiation machine. And when one of the scientists sarcastically suggests that he would be better off finding a nice quiet atoll somewhere in the South Pacific, his response, that he would then only need to worry about radiation, is equally telling. By the beginning of the 1970s, concerns about sustainability and the environment were beginning to take hold, with what we now recognise as the modern environmental movement really gaining momentum from the 1960s onwards. Although concerns about pollution and conservation can be traced back to the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s, there were a number of key milestones from the 1960s onwards that fed into the movement we now know today. In 1962, the writer and conservationist Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring, about the impact of man's interference on increasingly fragile ecosystems, particularly the effects of the pesticide DDT. The writer argued that it and other similar compounds should be more properly termed biocides, to highlight the fact that their effects are not limited to solely targeting pests. In the book, she accuses the chemical industry of intentionally spreading disinformation and public officials of accepting industry bribes. Although her work largely focused on the effects of pesticides on the natural ecosystem, she also detailed cases of human pesticide poisoning, including cancer and other illnesses. Although its publication was met with fierce opposition by chemical companies, it became a bestseller and ultimately led to a reversal in American policy on pesticides, a nationwide ban on DDT for agricultural uses, and also a movement that led to the creation of the US Environmental Protection Agency. It's since been named as one of the 25 greatest science books of all time. And with this in mind, it is of course no coincidence that DDT is referenced in Manchester Morgue, with one of the scientists stating that their machinery is even more effective than that pesticide when it first came out, leading George to retort, "DDT causes cancer. How about this?" As well as pesticides, there were also significant concerns about other pollutants. In 1967, the oil tanker Torrey Canyon ran aground off the coast of Cornwall, causing an environmental disaster, and a similar incident occurred in 1969, when an offshore well spilled oil into the Santa Barbara Channel in the US. In addition, lead in petrol, which had been a concern since its creation, became more of an issue. General Motors, DuPont, and Standard Oil, who had been making billions from the product, had been warned of the dangers as early as 1925. But it was not until 1965 that studies conclusively proved the impact of leaded petrol on humans. Even then, it took 10 years for the US Environmental Protection Agency to begin phasing it out. And in the UK, leaded petrol wasn't completely banned until 1999. And yet, as recently as 2021, studies found that airborne particles in London were still heavily laced with lead, up to 40% of it linked to car pollution, even though the fuel itself had been banned and out of use for over 2 decades. In 1968, American writer Cliff Humphrey founded the organization Ecology Action, and in one media-baiting stunt, gathered 60 people in Berkeley, California, to smash his 1958 Dodge Rambler into the street, declaring, quote, "These things pollute the earth," end quote. A year later, a group of Canadian and American activists set out to merge peace with ecology, founding the organization Greenpeace. The co-founder, Ben Metcalfe, commissioned 12 billboard signs around Vancouver, each bearing the legend, "Ecology. Look it up. You're involved." The first Earth Day, created to give awareness to environmental issues, was celebrated on April the 22nd, 1970. And then, in 1972, the UN Conference on the Human Environment was held in Stockholm, and this was the first time that representatives of multiple global governments were united in discussion relating to the state of the environment. All of which gives the environmental message of the film a far greater context. Governments might have begun to take ecology issues seriously, but that's debatable, but it had been a long time coming. This also explains the dialogue given to Dr. Duffield when he and George visit the farm. "It's never wise to exaggerate," he says. "We can't even get the government to act on much more serious and concrete facts. Imagine how much success we would have getting somebody to do something just on a hypothesis. I'm afraid they'd laugh at us." Fortunately for us, though, as we all know, the doctor has since been proven wrong, as government and industry of course paid clear attention to the ecological warnings of the 1970s, and absolutely none of those concerns remain a problem today. If the messaging of the film is a little heavy-handed at points, part of this is down to the characterization of George. Although he does end up being the hero of the piece, I think it's fair to say that, for the first half of the movie at least, he comes across as rather insufferable. It's probably fair enough that he is angry with Edna for the accident at the petrol station, and that, as a result, he has found himself in an impossible situation. But he is continually aggressive to everyone around him, including Edna, the scientists at the farm, and even the eccentric old lady running the equally eccentric Owl Inn, which seems a tad unwarranted. He also aggressively overtakes, and then flips off, the driver of a mortuary van, which certainly acts as an omen of events to come. Part of this perception, though, may be down to the incredibly dubious nature of the post-production dubbing, which gives him a bizarre estuary Essex accent that doesn't exactly seem to fit the actor's physique. Quite why this was done remains a mystery. Actor Ray Lovelock was English-Italian, and had already appeared in several English-language movies, so the decision to revoice him and the choice of accent seems somewhat strange. And, incidentally, the actor chosen for the redub was the English actor John Steiner, who Euro horror fans will remember from his roles in Mario Bava's 1977 movie Shock and Dario Argento's Tenebrae, released in 1982. Ray Lovelock was born in Rome on the 19th of June 1950 to an Italian mother and an English father, who met during the Allied occupation of the country during World War II. A strikingly handsome man, while at college he supplemented his income as an extra in movies and TV adverts, and also performed in a rock band with his friend Thomas Milian, who would himself go on to have a successful acting career. Lovelock's first screen appearance was an uncredited bit part in the 1965 Julie Christie movie Darling, but his first on-screen credit was in Django Kill, If You Live Shoot, in 1967, which starred his friend Thomas Milian. His breakthrough role came a year later in the crime thriller Bandits in Milan, also starring Thomas Milian, and which is also known as The Violent Four. More films followed, including the 1970 Italian horror Queens of Evil, in which he plays a young man taken in by three sisters following a motorcycle accident. It's currently available to watch for free on the streaming service TUBI. It's rather a slow film, but it's strangely compelling, and also features quite possibly one of the most seductive depictions of evil on film. The three sisters spend their days dressed to the nines, in a house decorated with glamorous photos of themselves, and eat endless cream cakes for breakfast. And if that's what Satanism looks like, someone tell me where I can sign up. A year later, he made the cult movie Oasis of Fear, directed by Umberto Lenzi, and also appeared in the musical Fiddler on the Roof. By the time he was approached for Manchester Morgue, he had appeared in 17 movies, but was still rather worried that he looked too baby-faced to play the lead role. Grau suggested that he grow his hair longer, as well as grow a beard, both of which feed quite nicely into the inspector's narrative that he is a dangerous hippie. By all accounts, when Lovelock looked in the mirror after first being in costume and makeup, he himself was incredibly surprised by the transformation. Damsel in distress, Edna, is played by Cristina Galbo, a Spanish actress who had already starred in the 1969 movie La Residencia, also known as The House That Screamed, and in the cult Italian giallo What Have You Done to Solange, filmed in 1972. Grau would later describe her casting as serendipitous, saying in an interview, quote, "The world is full of coincidences." Cristina was chosen because the film was practically Italian, but a certain amount of Spanish involvement was needed, including the cinematographer and myself. Cristina lived in Rome, but she was Spanish. She had a name that didn't really sound Spanish, which was good for the film's international sales, and she also had made films in Italy. It was a mutual agreement. But unfortunately, her husband died in the days leading up to filming. So for her, filming in cemeteries, making a film about death, was very difficult. She carried a tension that she channeled into her performance. If you've seen any of Cristina's other films, you'll see that she's never been as intense as in this one, partly because I asked her to be, but partly because she needed to release the tension she was carrying inside. End quote. This doubtless led to her near-hysterical performance in the film's set piece in the cemetery, as well as her convincing state of shock when George, rather unwisely as it turns out, leaves her in the care of a local petrol station while he goes to put an end to the zombified Martin. Grau described the relationship between George and Edna as a love story that ends just as it begins, and by the climax of the movie, one could say he has a point. If you squint a bit, their initial encounter and mismatched pairing is rather reminiscent of a 1940s screwball comedy. That is, if Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert had to fight off hordes of zombies, and that's a film I would pay good money to watch. One almost expects her to call him the most impossible person she's ever met, and being honest, you could hardly blame her if she did. But as the reality of their situation kicks in, his abrasive demeanour softens, possibly because he realises that Edna has been right all along. On rewatching the film, Grau noted this perspective, saying, quote, "The film is the genesis of an impossible love story. The two main characters are searching for the girl's sister. Her sister is at a hospital and people are becoming zombies. The protagonist appears with a torch to kill them, to get rid of them. But then, when he finds the girl he's looking for, he finds out that she has become a zombie, and so he has to burn her. When we were shooting the scene, I felt we had to do this for no reason. The girl looks at the guy with love. While he's burning her, she's reaching out, as if she was asking him to stay. This is a love that ends just in the beginning of its existence. Because if the film continued with two zombies, would it be a love story? Wouldn't it? That's another question." End quote. The film has multiple set pieces, including the climactic attack at the hospital and the wonderfully atmospheric appearance of Zombie Martin emerging through the mist and attacking Edna as she attempts to escape. My favourite, however, is the scene in the church crypt, where George takes Edna to cure her of her quote-unquote fancy hallucinations. This is immediately preceded by the ironic line, "The dead don't walk around except in very bad paperback novels," followed by a lengthy shot of a church sign that reads, quote, "This is God's acre, sacred to him, sacred to those whose bodies rest here. Let nothing defile it. In it, speak and act reverently. Cherish the flowers." End quote. Which is grimly humorous in hindsight, given the level of defiling that is about to occur. Although the exteriors were filmed on location in the Peak District, the interiors were shot in studios in Rome and Madrid, giving Grau the ability to utilise lighting to great effect. Once the door slams shut, the crypt is lit with the flickering orange of flaming torches, giving a slightly stroboscopic effect to the backgrounds. This scene introduces the unique lore surrounding Grau's zombies, who are resurrected not through bite or infection, but by the ritualistic anointing of blood, a mockery of baptism that almost suggests a perverse rebirth. They transmit life to each other through the blood of the living, like a plague, says George, which doesn't particularly make a great deal of sense, but then again, a zombie movie isn't really where you should go looking for logic. Another variation on the typical zombie lore is the method by which the undead can be destroyed. The shoot them in the head trope initiated by Romero had not been fully absorbed into zombie mythology, and here a bullet to the brain barely slows them down, with fire seemingly the only way to kill them. Nevertheless, despite the rather strange way in which they are resurrected, Grau has said he wanted to create a naturalistic approach with his monsters, even going so far as to give each actor a backstory and motivation. This suggests a retained intelligence in the undead, which would later be used as a theme by George Romero himself in the third of his zombie series, Day of the Dead. This certainly explains why the zombified Martin is so relentless in his pursuit of Edna and Katie, and also Katie's subsequent attack on her sister, and, very importantly, why George turns up in the final reel. In this moment, he exacts a violent revenge on the inspector, making a mockery of his earlier words, "I wish the dead could come back to life, you bastard, because then I could kill you again." The sequence in the crypt was also inspired by a story from Grau's childhood, when his mother would tell him that if he didn't behave, the dead would come at night and grab his feet to pull him under the bed. This is an image that clearly stayed with him for decades, as in this scene we see the dead grabbing both George and Edna by their feet as they struggle to escape. Once outside, they meet a police officer, Constable Craig, and it is in the next few moments that we are truly introduced to the film's special effects, which come courtesy of Giannetto De Rossi. De Rossi began his career as a makeup artist on the 1962 comedy romance The Hours of Love. In 1968, he did the makeup for Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, and then continued working across a wide range of films. Although he would go on to create makeup effects for Lucio Fulci's Zombie, The Beyond, and The House by the Cemetery, as well as working on David Lynch's Dune and the French extremity film High Tension, Manchester Morgue was, at least as far as I can tell, his first true horror film. He and Grau were particularly concerned about the colour of blood, which in many European horrors is often far too bright, looking more like paint than the real thing, and you only have to watch a handful of Spanish horrors or Italian gialli to see that quite clearly for yourself. As a result, they spent many hours darkening the blood makeup to ensure that it looked far more realistic, which gives the film a far grittier feel than many other Euro horror films of the same period. Another contribution was the blood-red eyes of the living dead, an image that in hindsight anticipates the eyes of the infected in the film 28 Days Later, as well as its many sequels. I can find no confirmation at all that Manchester Morgue acted as an inspiration for this image, but it's hard to imagine that Danny Boyle hasn't seen this movie, and in my head, I like to imagine that it did. The focus on realism also extends to the dead themselves, who, being brutally honest, look far more convincing than the purple and blue-faced zombies we would see 4 years later in Romero's Dawn of the Dead. This is particularly true of the zombies rising in the crypt, which genuinely look like reanimated corpses, with a lifelessness and death-like pallor which seems far more appropriate than the ones produced by Tom Savini in 1978. But it is what happens above ground that makes the film so notorious, beginning with the death of policeman Craig at the hands of the zombies, and who is then ripped apart and eaten. And this is then followed by the jaw-dropping attack at the hospital, with an attack on the receptionist, who suffers an equally grisly fate. It is perhaps not surprising then that in the 1980s its VHS release was declared a video nasty, though it was not actually prosecuted, and was eventually released with 2 minutes cut, including aspects of the death of the nurse, the killing in the churchyard, and also the murder of the doctor with an axe. The screenplay had originally been called Weekend of the Dead, a title that Grau was not particularly impressed with, so he suggested calling it Valley of the Dead instead, and this was the title under which it went into production. However, in post-production, producer Amati argued that the title should be changed again, and screenwriter Sandro Continenza suggested a title which translates to Do Not Profane the Sleep of the Dead. Grau was not in favour of the new title, feeling it too long, but producer Amati had the final word. Despite this, though, in Italy, it was temporarily released under the title Dove Vai, which means Where Are You From? This was an attempt to cash in on the many question-based film titles that were in vogue in Italy at the time, including Who Saw Her Die, What Have You Done to Solange, What Have They Done to Your Daughters, and the blatant Exorcist ripoff, Who's There? However, this title failed to attract crowds, and it was quickly reverted back to the Italian version of You Shall Not Profane. The film premiered in Spain on the 30th of September 1974, in Italy on the 28th of November the same year, and in the UK it was paired as part of a double bill with Pete Walker's Frightmare. In the US, it was released in 1975, with the title Don't Open the Window, which makes as much sense as many of the others, and with poster artwork highlighting the risks of playing with nature. The poster also borrowed the It's Only a Movie strapline from Last House on the left. I've not been able to find reliable box office records for the film's release in any region, but Grau has said the film did not do particularly well in Spain. This was something that he blamed on the deteriorating health of General Franco, which diverted the attention of the country away from fictional horrors as they waited for their dictator to die. But the film did get a second lease of life several years later, when it was screened, uncut, on national TV as part of the series Stories to Keep You Awake. This was hosted by Narciso Ibáñez Serrador, a name that we have mentioned multiple times in the past, and that you'll hear about again a little bit later. Needless to say, this screening was both a shock and a sensation, and ensured the film's permanence in Spanish horror history. After making Manchester Morgue, Arthur Kennedy continued his acting career, including appearances in the horror films The Antichrist in 1974, The Sentinel in 1977, and the Euro thriller 9 Guests for a Crime, also in 1977. Following the death of his wife in the mid-1970s, he lost interest in filmmaking, though he returned to the screen in 1989 with a film called Signs of Life. His final film, Grandpa, was released posthumously, following his death from cancer in January 1990. He was 75 years old. Cristina Galbo made 20 more screen appearances before retiring from acting in 1988. According to Wikipedia, she moved to California and opened a flamenco dancing school, where she was working up until 2020. Ray Lovelock had a very long career in film and television, as well as a successful career as a recording artist. Over the course of this career, he made over 100 screen appearances, including the 1975 giallo Autopsy, the 1978 exploitation film Last House on the Beach, and the disco giallo Murder Rock in 1984. He died, aged 67, in November 2017. Jorge Grau would not direct another horror film, but would continue directing and writing into the 1990s, with his final film, Better Times, released in 1995. He died on the 26th of December 2018, aged 88. Although The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, or whatever title you know it by, was somewhat overshadowed by Dawn of the Dead in 1978 and the endless slew of Italian rip-offs that sprung up afterwards, for me, this is one of the best zombie movies of the 1970s, if not one of the best zombie movies of the 20th century. Rather depressingly, with its themes of environmental collapse, ignorance, fascism, and state brutality, like many of the films we have covered so far in this series, The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue is evidence to the fact that no matter how old the movie, they are all still, sadly, relevant today. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, and this is When Evil Lurks from 2023. It stars Ezequiel Rodriguez, Demian Salomon, Silvina Sabater, and Luis Ziembrowski, and was written and directed by Demian Rugna. Demian Rugna was born on September 13th, 1979, in a province of Buenos Aires, Argentina. A fan of cinema from an early age, he was particularly fond of the 80s action movies of Stallone, Norris, and Schwarzenegger, and began creating his own comic books at the age of 8, recreating scenes from his favourite films. This interest led him to later study with Horacio Lalia, an Argentinian-born comic artist whose work includes Planet of the Damned, Star-Lord, 2000 AD, and Eagle. His initial interest in action movies was what led him into the horror genre, with the guns, violence, and blood acting as a natural conduit. He says that the film which made him a true die-hard horror fan was Friday the 13th Part 3, the second movie in the series to feature Jason Voorhees as the killer, and also the film in which the trademark hockey mask was introduced. In the early 2000s, he studied audio-visual design at the University of Morón in Buenos Aires, where he made his first short film, El Pacto, which featured his childhood friend Demian Salomon, an actor with whom he would work regularly over his career and who plays the character of Jamie in When Evil Lurks. In the interview for the second sight release of the film, Rugna describes how he and Salomon, who have been friends since the age of 6, grew their respective careers side by side, and says that even today, working together feels like playing as they did when they were kids, and that the actor brings a freshness and a sense of mischief that he finds, quote-unquote, really fun. Salomon also appeared in Rugna's next short, Tienen, Miedo, made in 2003, just as the director was graduating from university. With a title that translates to He is Afraid, this is an 8-minute black and white movie which anticipates his breakthrough film Terrified and features Salomon being menaced by something in his small apartment. You can find the film on YouTube, and I'll also link it in the show notes. Salomon is also present in his next film, a 25-minute short titled La Última Entrada, or The Last Gateway, which acted as a dress rehearsal for his first feature that we'll discuss in a few moments. Both of these shorts address themes that would be recurrent in the director's subsequent works, featuring normal people who are suddenly pulled into the world of the supernatural, and who must then make sense of the world as it pivots and shifts around them. Whether this is a menacing figure terrorizing a man alone in his apartment, or, as in the case of The Last Gateway, a man who discovers that the very gates of hell have opened in his stomach. 2 more shorts followed, El Nino and El Cachetazo, both in 2004, and then he began work on extending The Last Gateway into his first feature, expanding the plot, but keeping the central and, frankly, rather bizarre premise intact. Rugna has described the process of making this film as challenging, not helped by the attitudes towards horror in the Argentinian film community of the time. He has name-checked the actor and producer Narciso Ibáñez Menta as being a key influence over the horror genre in Argentina from the 1930s onwards. This is a man that we mentioned briefly back in episode 7, as he was the father of Narciso Ibáñez Serrador, a key figure in Spanish horror films and who we also mentioned earlier. However, Mentor's golden era ended in the late 1980s, after which time the cultural appetite for horror changed, and there was, according to Rugna, quote, a gap of, let's say, over 20 years with almost no horror films, end quote. Naturally, this made financing his first movie something of a challenge, with producers generally unwilling to risk financing a genre that had fallen out of fashion, in popular culture, at least. He has also said that the same challenge applied to finding actors, who, having never worked in the horror genre, felt a certain amount of distrust. And this certainly explains the gap between his final shorts in 2004 and the eventual release of his debut feature, The Lost Gateway, 3 years later in 2007. Much like his short of the same name, the full-length feature concerns a man who has the gateway to hell in his stomach, which, as it transpires, occurs simply through being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Filmed in English and then redubbed in post-production, it is a very strange movie that, whilst not being the greatest in terms of pacing or performance, certainly sets the foundation for his later triumphs. I wouldn't exactly say I recommend it, as the dubbing and the pacing are rather off-putting, even for me, but it does feature some striking visual imagery and some terrific practical effects. It's currently available in many regions on streaming, and at the very least, there is more imagination on display here than there is in many mainstream pictures. I would say it's probably more for completists and for those who are keen to see the origins of the director's work, but that being said, it was chosen as one of the 10 best horror films of the year by the website Buried.com. So, who am I to judge? In 2008, he wrote an original screenplay for a movie called They Want My Eyes, which was directed by Sergio Eskenazi and released a year later in 2009. His sophomore feature was an anthology picture called Damned Bastards, which he co-wrote and co-directed with Fabian Forte, and which also starred his friend Demian Salomon. I have yet to see this, but it is on my list, so if anyone has any thoughts, I would be very keen to hear them. Following a few more shorts, his next feature was a 2016 black comedy called You Do Not Know Who You Are Talking To, which was also, I think, released in some regions under the title Online. And then, in 2017, he released the film that would mark his international breakthrough, and this is a movie called Terrified. Terrified, at points at least, feels like an anthology movie, weaving together a series of short vignettes with an overarching narrative about a haunted community. But as the film progresses, through a very effective manipulation of timelines, it reveals that these stories are connected by far more than mere location. Starring Demian Salomon, one of these stories is an extension of the 2003 short Tienen, Miedo, featuring a man terrorized by a monstrous figure hiding in his bedroom. But for me, the standout scene features the corpse of a small child that appears sitting at a table in a resident's kitchen. I first saw the film at London's Fright Fest in 2018, and at the time I was completely blown away by the storytelling and the palpable sense of dread that runs throughout. It's currently available to watch on Shudder, and as I'll be talking about it more later in the series, I will say nothing further. For the moment, anyway. Terrified was such a success that there was very nearly an English-language remake under the production of Guillermo del Toro, but this fell through due to the pandemic. Instead, then, he concentrated on finding producers for When Evil Lurks, having finished the screenplay before the pandemic turned the world upside down. He did, however, also find time to direct a segment of the 2022 anthology Satanic Hispanics, which is currently available to stream, in the US at least, on Shudder. Like many anthology movies, this is, in my opinion, a little bit of a hit-and-miss affair, but Rugna's section, which is the first one you get to beyond the initial wraparound story, is highly effective. Once again, starring Demian Salomon, the story, titled Tambien lo vi, or I Saw It Too, tells of a man who finds an unusual phenomena inside his grandmother's house. I won't say any more for fear of spoiling it, but again this demonstrates the director's penchant for claustrophobic spaces and regular people who get caught up in very irregular events. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so if you have yet to watch the movie, please tread very carefully from this point onwards. When Evil Lurks tells the story of two brothers, Pedro and Jaime, who live in a remote farming community somewhere in Argentina. One night they hear gunshots in nearby woodland and on investigating the next morning discover the lower half of a mutilated human corpse. This discovery leads them to the shack of a woman called Maria Elena and her two sons, Eduardo and Uriel. Uriel has been possessed by a demon and has become a quote-unquote rotten, a physical host for the demon as it waits to be reborn. The police are frankly about as much help as the police in Manchester Morgue, and Pedro and Jaime turn to a local landowner, Ruiz, for help. Ruiz insists that they break protocols and dump the rotten as far away as they can, and loading him into their truck, they drive off to do exactly that. However, on the journey, Uriel is misplaced following a near accident, after which all hell, quite literally, starts to break loose. The film was partly inspired by Rugna's love of Sam Raimi's Evil Dead, and also his desire to make a possession movie that threw all of the established tropes out of the window. As opposed to the common, and now very tired conventions, this film has no place for religion, something that is established very early on. Maria Elena confesses that Uriel's possession has gone on for so long because she tried to pray it away, to which Pedro sharply responds, "Churches are dead." Rugna has said, "I'm not a religious guy. I refuse religion in all my life. So I thought about making an exorcism movie about killing the religion, killing the gods, and how we need a science to know how to control this demon as a pest or as a virus." As if to underline this sentiment, it is repeated in the film by the character of Miedo, a member of an order dedicated to the destruction of the rotten and who, in previous life, used to run a fraudulent church. "God is dead," she tells Pedro, and the time of churches ended quickly. In this film, then, the rotten is like an infection, spread from person to person like a disease. Whilst Rugna has been at pains to state that the overall narrative was not inspired by anything other than his imagination, he has said that the demonic figure of the rotten most certainly was, saying in an interview with the Hollywood News, quote, "The rotten guy was inspired by the families who live in the middle of the country, infected by pesticides. Those families are living in poverty and illness. Nobody cares about them, and they are used to dying and used to growing up with cancer when they are children. I thought, what could happen if, instead of cancer, instead of illness because of this pesticide, it's a demon. The demon is the pesticide. This is what inspired me, not for the entire movie, but for the character." End quote. Every year, 385 million people fall ill from pesticide contamination, and 95% of them are in the Southern Hemisphere. Despite this, spraying continues across South America at all hours of the day and in all weather conditions, regardless of water protection or minimum distances to homes and schools. Most of this is driven by the demands of the lucrative export market. In Argentina, farmers are using increasing amounts of pesticides, herbicides, and other chemicals to boost crop yields, particularly soya, which accounts for more than 50% of the total agricultural land in the country. In 2020, the environmental website Mongabe reported on the impact of pesticides in Argentina's Gran Chaco region, and they told the story of a rural farmer, Carolina Sendra, and I'm going to read directly from that article now. Carolina Sendra owns a small field about 20 kilometers, roughly 12 miles, from the town of Napanee in Argentina's Chaco province. On her 10 hectares, about 25 acres, she grows squash, cassava and fruit trees, what are known as service crops. About 4 years ago, she says, I had a serious health problem, diarrhea and cramps that prevented me from sleeping. The doctors couldn't tell me what the problem was. In the end, I was hospitalized for almost a year. It was intestinal poisoning caused by the agrochemicals that the water in my house contained. This is not an isolated case. In much of the Gran Chaco ecoregion, water is scarce and must be carefully collected during the rainy season. We have a tank of about 3,000 litres or 800 gallons on the roof of our house, Sendra explained, and from it we get the water to drink, cook, shower and feed the animals. She continues, the aerial spraying began about 4 years ago. Planes were flying over my house all the time. The first effects of the pesticides were seen on the leaves of squash as they began to die, similar to frost damage. Then I started to feel ill. It was not just my intestines. All of us at home had red and itchy skin after bathing. We complained, and they came to analyze the water. The water in the tank and in the well was heavily contaminated by agrochemicals. And although we managed to stop the spraying carried out by airplanes, the effects continue today. I have to take good care of myself when I eat meals, and my oldest daughter has respiratory problems. At the film's Q&A, during its 2023 Fantastic Fest premiere, Rugna spoke on the subject, saying, quote, the owners of those lands contaminate the fields with glyphosate to kill bugs, pesticide. There's a lot of people who work in those fields, and they get cancer. You'd probably see a little kid with cancer because they are the workers. They didn't say anything, or if they said something, nobody knows. Sometimes you see something in the news, but then there's nothing more to say and you forget the image. They're in the middle of nothing, the middle of poverty. They must do work for less than a couple of dollars, and they're all ill. After you turn off the television, you forget. But they are still there. They are still probably going to die. End quote. As the film continues, we learn that the idea of demonic possession and of the rotten is commonplace, and that while many people may have never seen one, the government even have protocols to enact when one is discovered, though these seem to be less about offering help and more about containment or avoidance. More importantly, we learn that there are 7 rules that must be adhered to in order to ensure one's survival, though wisely, Rugna sprinkles these across the narrative as the film progresses. 1. Don't use electric lights. 2. Don't stay close to animals. 3. Don't take anything that was close to them. 4. Don't hurt them. 5. Never name the evil by its name. 6. Don't shoot them with firearms. And 7. Don't be afraid of dying. A masterclass in the adage of show and don't tell, the screenplay uses audience observation, folk tales, and sheer bloody violence to hit these points home, wisely avoiding the danger of exposition dumping that so often spoils similar movies. Even before the rules are spelled out, it becomes quickly apparent that a rotten is not something one can easily kill. In fact, killing it only serves to spread the infection, particularly if that killing involves the use of firearms. Knowing this, the infected often invite their own death, as we see in the opening scenes with Uriel, and in the rather brilliant footage of a demonically possessed goat placing its forehead against the barrel of Ruiz's loaded shotgun. And just in case we were in any doubt of the consequences, the shooting of the goat is followed in rapid succession by Ruiz's pregnant wife Jimena, quickly dispatching him with an axe to the head before turning the weapon on herself. This is a film in which cinematic taboos are there to be broken, but rather than gore for the sake of it, here these scenes support the lore and drive the narrative forward. The violence gradually reveals more of the mythology, as well as delivering more than its fair share of shocks, and also demonstrating character flaws in the protagonists. Despite knowing the rules that must be adhered to, our nominal hero Pedro is remarkably slapdash, not only in his initial actions, which spread the infection in the first place, but also in his blatant disregard of Myrta's request that he not leave her alone, an act of angry defiance that leads to her brutal demise by hammer and to the ultimate rebirth of evil. Even more tellingly, his careless disposal of his infected clothes at the home of his estranged family causes multiple deaths and leads to the film's most notorious scene. In a post-pandemic world, this negligence has taken on a new significance, with many drawing comparisons to the era's disregard for social protocols. However, given that it was written before 2019, these readings are far more to do with audience optics than they are to do with the director's intention. Speaking with the website goreinthestore.uk, Rugna has revealed that the similarities initially caused doubt as to whether he should even make the movie, saying, quote, "I said to my wife, I don't know if I want to make this movie, because now a lot of movies are going to be like this one. If you think of this demon as a pandemic, you have this contentious idea of complying with the rules or non-complying. When we were in a pandemic, we had a lot of rules which are similar to the ones of keeping the demon away in the film. There was the idea of, okay, he has an illness, we need to get rid of him because it's going to spread everywhere. But it wasn't a pandemic movie. I didn't write it with that in mind because I had written it almost 2 years before." End quote. By the time that Pedro arrives at his ex-wife Sabrina's house, it is apparent that contact spreads the infection, but he casually allows the family dog to sniff at his discarded garments while he argues with Sabrina. And although we suspect what may happen next, with a significant amount of tension built in the viewer, it is still quite jaw-dropping when the dog attacks Sabrina's little girl Vicky, grabbing her by the head and then dragging her off down the street. Rugna has said that this scene is one that he has had in his head for years, only, quote, "It was with a baby, not with a little girl, and it was always there. In my head it stayed there, and I never found the right movie to include it in. And then, well, it fit into the movie. I finally used the scene I've had in my head for years." End quote. So, the more sensitive among you may want to thank heaven for small mercies. So, pregnant women, children, and animals do not get a pass in this movie. Pregnant Jimena axes herself in the face. Little Vicky is mauled by the dog, and the dog is then shot, though by this point, it has to be said, we are pretty happy to see him go. School children become possessed and are then punched repeatedly in the face, a scene which even Rugna's production designer wife said she thought was going too far, and, in a moment I found even more shocking than the dog sequence, little Santino is kidnapped by his possessed mother, and we later see her wandering down the street, scooping his brains out of his head as if it were an ice cream. Perhaps unsurprisingly, filming this footage caused a few issues with the government, with strict child labour and protection laws creating significant and quite understandable obstacles. In the director's interview on the Second Sight 4K Special Edition, Rugna explains some of the challenges that this presented. Quote, "The bureaucracy of having a child working on a film is way harder than working with animals. With kids, it's impossible, because they cut your hours, they make everything tangled, everything difficult basically, so that the child doesn't work. So there are absurd regulations and absurd restrictions. You can't, for example, during a shoot, have someone yell at a kid, like an actor isn't allowed to yell at a kid, for instance. Stupid stuff like that you have to work around. So, imagine a horror movie where a kid's holding a hammer and has to kill a woman. That's totally forbidden. So you have to find creative ways to do it and make sure the kids don't end up traumatized. End quote. Despite his misgivings about the screenplay having notable similarities to pandemic protocols, in 2021 Rugna submitted it to the Sitges Pitchbox, an international film event hosted by Film Market Hub at the Sitges Film Festival. Winning second place, the script caught the attention of the film market, and in particular Shudder, at which point financing started to become easier to secure. Even then, though, with the financing in place, production still took a while to begin, with financial and political challenges in Argentina and the gradual opening up of the country post-pandemic leading to delays. Casting was also a challenge, particularly when the director's first choices for the roles of the brothers became unavailable. While Demian Salomon in the role of Jaime was probably an obvious choice given their history, casting for the role of Pedro proved far more challenging. Ezequiel Rodriguez was recommended by Damned Bastards co-director Fabian Forte, and following an online audition, which was necessitated by the pandemic, Rugna realized that he was the perfect choice. And it's fair to say that the chemistry between the two brothers is palpable, from the cold open with the gunshots in the first act to the climax of the film, where they are both left shattered and broken. Rodriguez, in particular, gives a standout performance, playing a man that we discover has been on the edge of desperation for much of his adult life. This gives his reckless attitude and emotional reactions a grounding in psychological reality that manages to maintain audience empathy despite his actions being the root of all chaos. And incidentally, the markings made on his forehead at the end of the film are both telling and also highly ambiguous. Has he been marked for some form of future suffering? Or was he marked to deliver evil into this world all along? Only time and the planned sequel will tell. The film premiered at the Midnight Madness screening at the Toronto International Film Festival in September 2023, where it received an incredible and highly positive reaction. Apparently, though, one critic decided to rate it as mediocre. I'm not sure what film he was actually watching, but I think we can safely now say his views are firmly in the minority. It was released for a limited theatrical run on October the 6th, and then a few weeks later was released by streaming service Shudder, where it quickly gained rave reviews and a huge following. In Argentina, however, the film had an even greater reception, not only for its immersive storytelling, superb acting and direction, but also as an unintended and unexpected metaphor. On November the 19th, 2023, Javier Milei of the Freedom Advances Coalition won the presidential election, defeating the centre-left candidate Sergio Massa with 55.7% of the vote. Self-described as a right-wing libertarian and the oxymoronic anarcho-capitalist, really? His election was met in many quarters with concern and dismay. Rugna addressed this directly in an interview with the website goreinthestore.uk. Quote, "When I wrote this, I never imagined this asshole we have for president now was going to be in power. But yes, I'm a guy who's interested in the political situation and the societal problems we have because I'm part of that society. I'm part of the working class down here in Argentina, and my family is involved in ideas and political ideas, so I cannot avoid them. Everyone has lots of questions about fascism, about the class struggle, about the healthcare problems that have taken place after this president was elected. A lot of people took this movie and took the posters of this movie to protest and to go on strikes. to take it as a symbolic piece of art against the fascism which is growing more in Argentina now. End quote. The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue and When Evil Lurks are both films that subvert audience expectations of their respective themes of zombies and demonic possession. Jorge Grau's Living Dead might well devour their victims, but the shoot them in the head methodology has no power here, and the means by which they are reanimated is far more ritualistic than it is contagion. Demian Rugna's Rottens may be demonically possessed, but he sidesteps the tropes of pea soup vomit and spinning heads to create a far more unsettling mythology that, in an almost direct reversal of Grau's, is more about infection than it is religious ritual. And while his demonic contagion was inspired, in part, by the real-life pesticide catastrophe inflicted on South America, Grau's zombies are initially stirred by a fictional pesticide, a piece of experimental machinery that they boast is more effective than DDT. And finally, and rather depressingly, while Jorge Grau intended his film to be an indictment of a fascist state that was coming to an end, Demian Rugna's film has become an unintentional symbol for a fascism that it would appear is on the rise. And so, very unfortunately, put together, both films prove the adage that while history may not repeat itself, it very often rhymes. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. And if you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And please consider sharing this episode, or indeed any of the episodes from the series, with any horror-loving friends. As a reminder, you can email in with your thoughts and comments on any of the films we've covered in the series to thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also find our Instagram account at thehorrordouble. And speaking of history rhyming, next week we are returning to the world of 1940s horror noir and the Italian giallo, a topic that we first began to talk about back in episode 2. First up, we have The Spiral Staircase from 1946, directed by Robert Siodmak. This stars Dorothy Maguire, Ethel Barrymore, George Brent, and, if you didn't get enough of him, from Cat People and Curse of the Cat People, Kent Smith. He is, though, playing a rather more likeable character in this film. Well, marginally anyway. Then we follow this with a film from a director we have mentioned multiple times in this series, but we've never really spoken about in detail, and that is Mario Bava. So our second movie is his seminal work, 6 Women for the Killer, also known as Blood and Black Lace, from 1964. This stars Cameron Mitchell, Eva Bartok, Ariana Guarini, and Thomas Reiner. So if you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they are playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.